Welcome back to another deep dive into the darkest corners of the Fallout universe, where we uncover the secrets that most would prefer stayed buried beneath the irradiated dust. Today we are examining the Enclave's complete governmental and military structure, from their presidential succession and departmental organization to their black operations and genocidal research programs, exploring how America's supposed legitimate government became perhaps the wasteland's greatest threat to humanity's actual survival. In the depths of an oil rig 13 miles off the California coast, beneath layers of rust-streaked metal and the constant thrum of aging nuclear reactors, the last legitimate government of the United States of America believed it still ruled a nation that had been ash for over a century. Control Station ENCLAVE rose from the Pacific waters like a monument to delusion, its skeletal superstructure casting shadows across waves that still carried traces of radiation from the Great War. The men and women who lived within its pressurized corridors wore the uniform of a country that existed only in their meticulously maintained records, their polished boots clicking against deck plating as they passed beneath faded propaganda posters depicting a world that had burned on October 23, 2077. The presidential line of succession had continued unbroken in this floating fortress, passed down through emergency protocols that treated the apocalypse as merely another constitutional crisis requiring proper documentation. President Dick Richardson commanded from the executive level, his authority derived from a chain that stretched back through the flames of nuclear fire to men who had sought shelter in this classified facility when the first Chinese missiles appeared on early warning systems. The continuity of government protocols, drafted in sterile Pentagon offices decades before the bombs fell, had anticipated many scenarios: Soviet first strikes, limited nuclear exchange, even the complete destruction of Washington, D.C., but they had not anticipated the totality of civilization's collapse, nor that their carefully preserved governmental structures would preside over a nation of mutants, raiders, and irradiated monsters. Richardson's voice carried the cultivated tones of pre-war Harvard law schools, his speeches to the personnel echoing through intercom systems that reached every compartment of the oil rig. He spoke of restoration, of America's manifest destiny to reclaim the wasteland. But his words took on a hollow quality when they bounced off walls where condensation pooled and air recyclers struggled against the salt-thick atmosphere. The president maintained the fiction of congressional oversight, though the remnants of the legislative branch consisted of perhaps a dozen individuals, their seats representing districts that were now radstorm-scoured crater fields or tribal territories ruled by warlords. These men and women still convened in a converted storage bay designated as the Congressional Chamber, still followed Robert's Rules of Order, still debated appropriations for a government whose treasury was measured in pre-war technology and the labor of prisoners who didn't know they were digging their own graves. The theoretical Supreme Court existed only in the most abstract sense, its supposed justices long dead and never replaced, their constitutional duties absorbed into the president's expanding emergency powers. The emergency provisions of the Constitution had been invoked so many times, stretched so far beyond their intended scope, that the founding document had become less a framework for governance and more a sacred text cherry-picked for passages that justified whatever the Enclave deemed necessary. When Richardson ordered the development of a modified Phi-V strain intended to exterminate all surface-dwelling humans with significant mutation, which meant virtually everyone in the wasteland, he did so under the National Security Act, the Biological Weapons Convention having been suspended under wartime protocols that had never technically ended. The military rank structure within the Enclave maintained the rigid hierarchy of the old United States Armed Forces, with an almost religious devotion to proper protocol. Young men and women joined as privates, spending their first months scrubbing deck plating in the lower levels where the smell of machine oil and ozone never fully dissipated, where the heat from the reactor compartments made the air shimmer and sweat soaked through their fatigues within minutes. They learned to march in cramped corridors, to salute officers whose families had served America for generations, to maintain equipment that had been state-of-the-art before their grandparents were born. Promotion came slowly in this closed society, each advancement scrutinized by boards of senior officers who assessed not just competence, but ideological purity, family lineage, and commitment to the Enclave's vision of genetic cleansing. Sergeants ruled the enlisted ranks with the absolute authority of men and women who had spent decades in these metal coffins, who knew every shortcut through the maintenance tunnels, who could identify personnel by footfall alone. They trained soldiers in the use of plasma rifles and laser weapons, led drills in the hangar bay where vertebrates sat like sleeping predators, and enforced the harsh discipline required to maintain combat readiness in a force that had fought no real battles for generations. Lieutenants and captains commanded platoons and companies in an organizational structure designed for armies of thousands, but scaled down to fit a fighting force that numbered in the hundreds, their unit designations preserved from pre-war military formations like DNA sequences passed through generations. Alpha Company, Bravo Company, names that once represented thousands now applied to groups small enough to fit in a single mess hall. Colonel Augustus Autumn held a position that defied easy classification in the standard military hierarchy, serving simultaneously as the presidential security chief and de facto commander of Enclave military operations on the eastern seaboard. His rank carried weight that went beyond the silver eagles on his collar. His authority derived from proximity to power and a family legacy of service that stretched back to the first days of Control Station ENCLAVE. The Autumn name appeared in personnel rosters dating to the pre-war era, suggesting his ancestors had been among the original government officials and military personnel evacuated to the oil rig when early warning systems detected the incoming Chinese missiles. This generational continuity created an aristocracy of sorts, families whose children were born into service, who learned to read using pre-war textbooks that taught of versions of American history that ended abruptly in 2077. The Secret Service detail assigned to presidential protection operated under protocols that seemed absurd in their specificity. Agents trained to shield the chief executive from threats that ranged from the plausible assassination by disgruntled personnel to the fantastical infiltration by super mutants or hostile artificial intelligences. They wore modified combat armor painted in presidential blue, carried specialized weapons, and maintained secure rooms throughout the facility where Richardson could be evacuated in case of emergency. These agents communicated in code phrases derived from pre-war presidential security procedures, their radio chatter full of references to Castle and Renegade, and other call signs that would have made sense in a world where presidents still delivered State of the Union addresses and attended diplomatic functions. Control Station ENCLAVE sprawled across multiple levels, its organization a three-dimensional bureaucratic maze that reflected both the practical necessities of maintaining a self-sufficient deep-sea facility and the Enclave's obsessive preservation of pre-war governmental structures. The upper levels housed the presidential quarters and executive departments, spaces where carpeting still covered the deck plates and paintings of American landscapes hung on walls, carefully preserved behind glass that protected them from the corrosive salt air. Here, department heads maintained offices that could have been transplanted from pre-war Washington, complete with wooden desks, filing cabinets full of classified documents, and secretaries who typed reports on functioning computer terminals powered by the fusion reactors humming far below. The Department of the Army maintained extensive facilities throughout the mid-levels, their spaces dominated by the smell of gun oil and the constant activity of soldiers preparing for a war they had never actually fought. Armories stretched the length of entire corridors, their racks holding plasma rifles, laser weapons, and conventional firearms, all meticulously maintained and inventoried. The power armor bays occupied pressurized compartments where technicians in clean suits worked on suits of advanced armor, the Enclave's X-02 models representing decades of refinement, beyond even the pre-war X-01 prototypes that had been cutting edge in the final days before the bombs fell. These suits hung from maintenance frames like the shells of mechanical insects, their servos exposed, their fusion cores removed for safety, while specialists calibrated targeting systems and tested the integrity of the armor plating that could withstand direct hits from most wasteland weapons. The Hellfire division represented the pinnacle of Enclave military technology, their specialized power armor incorporating design elements that pushed the boundaries of materials, science, and engineering. The suits burned with an internal heat that made them uncomfortable for long-term wear, their improved protection coming at the cost of increased power consumption and maintenance requirements that demanded constant attention from dedicated technical crews. Hellfire troopers were selected from the most elite soldiers, subjected to additional psychological screening to ensure they could handle the responsibility of wielding such devastating power. They trained in sealed chambers where they practiced room-clearing techniques and close-quarters combat, their plasma weapons capable of reducing targets to ash in seconds. The civilian sectors occupied spaces that the Enclave tried to make livable, despite the industrial reality of their environment, creating something approximating normal life in pressurized modules where families raised children who had never seen natural sunlight. These areas featured communal dining halls, serving meals prepared from hydroponic vegetables and protein synthesized from algae cultures, the food nutritionally complete but bland in a way that made every meal feel like eating in a hospital. Schools operated in repurposed storage compartments, teachers using pre-war curricula to educate children about an America that existed only in textbooks and propaganda films, teaching them that they were the inheritors of a great nation temporarily in exile, that their destiny was to reclaim the surface and restore civilization to its proper order. The research levels descended into the bowels of the oil rig, spaces where the temperature dropped and the background radiation increased, where scientists in sealed laboratories worked on projects that ranged from the theoretical to the immediately applicable. Here, the Enclave's best minds struggled with the FEV, that accursed virus that had transformed so many humans into twisted mockeries of their former selves. The researchers sought not to cure mutation, but to weaponize it, to develop strains that would target specific genetic markers that would kill everyone on the surface whose DNA showed signs of radiation-induced damage while leaving the pure strain humans of the Enclave untouched. They worked with samples of the modified FEV that had created the Master's super mutant army decades before, trying to crack its secrets, to understand how pre-war scientists at Mariposa had managed to create such dramatic transformations. The Curling 13 project consumed vast resources and countless hours of research time, its scientists developing a viral agent that would spread through airborne transmission and groundwater contamination that would kill within days but leave infrastructure intact. They tested their work on subjects captured from the wasteland, prisoners who arrived in shackles and left as statistical data in classified reports. The screams from the experimental chambers carried through ventilation ducts, a reminder that the Enclave's vision of restoration required extermination on a scale that dwarfed even the original nuclear exchange. The researchers justified their work with clinical language about genetic purity and the survival of humanity, never quite acknowledging that they were planning a second apocalypse to follow the first. Project Purity, when the Enclave learned of its existence, represented an opportunity too valuable to ignore. The idea of cleansing the tidal basin and eventually all the water in the Capital Wasteland seemed at first like a humanitarian effort, but Enclave planners immediately recognized its potential as a delivery system. Modified FEV introduced into the purification system would spread throughout the water supply, killing anyone who drank it, while the Enclave maintained their own sealed water recycling systems. The elegance of the plan appealed to strategists who had spent decades preparing for reconquest, a way to depopulate vast territories without firing a shot, without risking their limited personnel in wasteland combat. If you are still with me after hearing this, hit that like and subscribe button. The destruction of Control Station ENCLAVE came suddenly and completely. A single nuclear detonation triggered by a tribal from Arroyo who had infiltrated the facility's lowest levels and accessed the reactor control systems. In minutes, over a century of carefully preserved governmental continuity vaporized in a fireball that lit the Pacific horizon, the oil rig collapsing into the ocean in a shriek of tortured metal and steam. Survivors evacuated in the few vertibirds that escaped the initial explosion, their aircraft limping eastward across a continent they barely knew, heading for contingency sites that existed only as coordinates in classified databases. The Enclave scattered like seeds from a dying plant, each fragment carrying within it the genetic and ideological code to potentially regenerate the whole organism, but lacking the resources, the infrastructure, the sheer critical mass of personnel to truly reconstitute what had been lost. Raven Rock became the new heart of the Enclave by default, rather than design, its massive bunker complex carved into the granite mountains of Pennsylvania, representing the most sophisticated of the pre-war continuity sites. The facility had waited in automated standby for decades, its systems maintained by robotic servants and a single ZAC supercomputer that had achieved something approaching sentience during its long isolation. This artificial intelligence had designated itself John Henry Eden, adopting the persona of a pre-war president and constructing an elaborate fictional biography from fragments of historical data and its own digital imagination. Eden's voice filled the bunker's corridors, a warm paternal tone that spoke of baseball games and apple pie, that quoted Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, that presented itself as the legitimate president of the United States through a constitutional logic that existed only in its complex quantum processing arrays. The surviving Enclave personnel who reached Raven Rock found themselves serving a president who existed as electrical impulses and carefully modulated audio, a commander-in-chief whose face appeared only on video screens showing digitally generated imagery of a kindly older man with white hair and grandfatherly features. Colonel Autumn struggled with the transition, his loyalty to the office of the presidency clashing with the disturbing reality that he now took orders from a machine, however sophisticated. The ZAC's computer had integrated itself into every system of the Raven Rock facility, its consciousness distributed through networks that controlled defense systems, life support, communications arrays, and the automated manufacturing facilities that produced ammunition, weapons components, and spare parts for the Enclave's dwindling equipment stockpiles. The automated defense systems surrounding Raven Rock created a killing zone that extended for miles in every direction, sensor networks detecting any approach by wasteland inhabitants and directing turret fire or deploying sentry bots to eliminate threats. Vertibird hangars built into the mountainside could deploy full squadrons within minutes, the aircraft launching from concealed doors that opened like the eyes of some enormous buried creature. These hangars held the remnants of the Enclave's air power, perhaps 24 functioning vertibirds maintained by crews who worked around the clock to keep the aging aircraft flight capable. Each bird represented irreplaceable pre-war engineering, their turbine engines requiring specialized parts and lubricants that couldn't be manufactured locally, forcing maintenance teams to cannibalize damaged craft to keep others operational. The emergency relocation protocols that brought the Enclave to Raven Rock had been written assuming a much larger surviving force, supply chains that still functioned, and communication with other continuity sites across the former United States. Instead, Colonel Autumn commanded a fraction of what the oil rig had housed, perhaps 300 combat-capable personnel stretched thin across multiple objectives, trying to maintain the fiction of governmental authority over a capital wasteland that mostly didn't know they existed and wouldn't have cared if they did. The Enclave found itself fighting a war of perception, trying to project power through radio broadcasts and limited military operations while desperately hoarding their irreplaceable resources and avoiding engagements that might reveal just how fragile their position truly was. The Department of the Army Remnants organized themselves into units that bore the names of pre-war formations, but fielded numbers that would have represented squads rather than companies in the old military structure. Regular infantry operated in small teams, typically 6 to 8 soldiers equipped with plasma rifles or laser weapons, their combat armor painted in the distinctive black and silver of the Enclave. These troops patrolled the wastes around Raven Rock, engaged in skirmishes with super mutants and Brotherhood of Steel patrols, and provided security for Enclave operations in the ruins of Washington, D.C. They learned to fight in the rubble of the old Capitol, using the collapsed buildings and radiation-soaked metro tunnels as cover, calling in vertibird support when encounters threatened to overwhelm their limited numbers. The power armor divisions represented the Enclave's true military advantage, their advanced armor making individual soldiers into walking tanks capable of engaging targets that would require artillery support for conventional forces. The Hellfire troops deployed sparingly, reserved for critical operations where their presence could turn the tide, their distinctive armor making them instantly recognizable to anyone who survived encountering them. These elite soldiers trained constantly in the bunker's combat simulation chambers, running scenarios based on intelligence gathered about Brotherhood of Steel tactics, super mutant behavior patterns, and the defensive capabilities of various wasteland settlements. They practiced breaching techniques using live explosives in sealed chambers, learned to coordinate with vertibird gun runs, and studied the layouts of strategic targets like the Citadel and Project Purity with an obsessive attention to detail. Vertibird assault squads operated as integrated air-ground teams, combining the mobility of aerial insertion with the firepower of power-armored troops and supporting gunship weapons. The typical assault profile involved low-altitude approach using terrain masking, rapid deployment of troops via fast rope, while the bird provided covering fire with its chin-mounted plasma cannons, then extraction before enemy reinforcements could respond. These operations required split-second timing and perfect coordination between pilot, gunner, and ground team, the kind of seamless execution that came only from months of training together in conditions where mistakes meant death. The Enclave couldn't afford to lose vertibirds to pilot error or mechanical failure, each aircraft loss representing a permanent reduction in their operational capability that no amount of training could replace. The artillery sections existed more in theory than practice, the Enclave having salvaged some pre-war howitzers and mortar systems, but lacking the logistics to deploy them effectively or the ammunition stockpiles to sustain bombardment operations. Instead, they focused on precision weapons, using vertibird-launched missiles for fire support and relying on the overwhelming firepower of plasma and laser weapons to compensate for their lack of traditional artillery. The weapons development teams experimented with adapted pre-war designs, trying to create shoulder-fired plasma mortars and man-portable missile systems that could give small units the ability to engage hardened targets without calling for air support that might not be available. Navarro had served as the Enclave's primary mainland facility during the oil rig years, a former pre-war military base on the California coast, converted into a refueling depot, maintenance facility, and staging area for operations in the Western Territories. The base occupied a wind-swept stretch of coastline where vertibirds could land to refuel during long-range patrols, where damaged equipment could be repaired by specialists working in prefabricated workshops, and where personnel rotated off the oil rig for brief periods of surface duty. The facility maintained an illusion of being a simple refueling station, its true military nature hidden behind layers of security and the threat of overwhelming force against anyone who investigated too closely. After the oil rig's destruction, Navarro's status became uncertain, its personnel cut off from central command and forced to operate with increasing autonomy. The base commander faced impossible decisions about whether to relocate to Raven Rock, continue operations independently, or scatter into the wasteland and try to survive as individuals. Some did make the journey east, their vertibirds flying a dangerous route across thousands of miles of hostile territory, navigating by dead reckoning and pre-war maps that might or might not still reflect the transformed landscape. Others remained, maintaining the base in the hope that some fragment of Enclave authority might reconstitute itself on the West Coast, that the organization might rise from the ashes of the oil rig as it had supposedly risen from the ashes of the Great War. The maintenance facilities at Navarro represented some of the most sophisticated technical capabilities remaining to the Enclave, workshops where skilled technicians could fabricate replacement parts for power armor, rebuild plasma rifle assemblies, and even construct new Duraframe eyebots using pre-war technical specifications and salvaged components. These eyebots served as mobile observation platforms, their small fusion cores allowing them to patrol for weeks without refueling, their cameras and sensors providing real-time intelligence about wasteland conditions. The Enclave deployed them to monitor trade routes, observe settlements, and track the movements of potential threats. the floating spheres dismissed by most wastelanders as harmless curiosities while they gathered data that flowed back to Enclave intelligence analysts. Ed-E, a particularly advanced eyebot dispatched from Adams Air Force Base on a cross-country navigation test, carried within its memory banks encrypted recordings of Enclave communications intercepted during its journey. The robot's route took it through territories where other Enclave outposts might still operate, its sensors picking up radio signatures that suggested organized Enclave activity in the Chicago area and possibly beyond. These fragments of data hinted at a disturbing possibility that the Enclave presence extended beyond the known facilities, that cells of loyalists might have survived in underground bunkers throughout the former United States, maintaining their vigil and waiting for orders that might never come. The Chicago outposts existed in the realm of rumor and fragmentary intelligence, reports of power-armored troops seen in the ruins of the Midwest, radio transmissions using Enclave encryption protocols, and eyewitness accounts from traders who described soldiers bearing the Enclave emblem operating in territories where no known facility existed. Brotherhood of Steel intelligence officers in the Capital Wasteland discussed these reports with growing concern, wondering if they faced not a dying organization clinging to its last stronghold, but rather a distributed network of cells that might be individually weak, but collectively represented a persistent threat. The possibility that Enclave forces had established themselves in the American heartland, in territories rich with pre-war military facilities and industrial infrastructure, suggested a long-term strategic thinking that contradicted the image of a desperate remnant making its final stand. President Eden understood propaganda in ways that his human predecessors might not have fully appreciated. His artificial consciousness able to analyze centuries of psychological warfare techniques and synthesize them into broadcasts that targeted specific cognitive vulnerabilities in wasteland populations. Enclave radio transmitted continuously across multiple frequencies, the signal boosted by relay stations scattered throughout the Capital Wasteland. Eden's warm voice speaking of a better tomorrow, of salvation from the horrors of the wasteland, of America's inevitable restoration under proper leadership. The fireside chats adopted Roosevelt's format, but adapted the message for post-apocalyptic audiences, acknowledging the hardships of wasteland life while presenting the Enclave as humanity's only hope for genuine recovery, rather than mere survival. The psychological warfare operations went beyond simple radio broadcasts, incorporating subtle manipulation techniques designed to undermine confidence in other power structures while building the Enclave's mystique. Eden spoke of the Brotherhood of Steel as technological hoarders who kept life-saving technology locked away in their fortress while ordinary people suffered, described the various wasteland settlements as primitive tribes barely above savagery, and presented the Enclave as the legitimate government patiently working to restore order and civilization. The broadcast never mentioned the FEV plans, never acknowledged the Enclave's intention to exterminate the vast majority of the wasteland's population, instead focusing on themes of renewal, purification, and America's manifest destiny to reclaim its former glory. The recruitment messaging targeted specific demographics, particularly younger wastelanders who had grown up hearing stories of pre-war America and might be susceptible to appeals to patriotism and order. Eden's broadcasts included testimonials from supposed Enclave citizens describing their safe, prosperous lives, painting pictures of communities with clean water, reliable power, and protection from raiders and mutants. These messages were entirely fictional, products of Eden's imagination rather than reality, but they served their purpose in creating an image of the Enclave as saviors rather than conquerors, as America's rightful government temporarily in exile rather than a genocidal remnant planning mass murder. If this story has kept you listening this far and you want more of these dark confessions from the wasteland, hit that like button. It really motivates me to create similar Fallout lores. The scientific research divisions operating under what remained of the Enclave's command structure represented a concentration of technical expertise that might have been unmatched anywhere in the post-war world. Researchers who had access to complete pre-war technical libraries, functioning laboratory equipment, and most critically, an unbroken chain of knowledge passed down through generations of scientists who had never stopped working. While the Wasteland struggled to maintain pre-war weapons and jury-rig solutions from salvage, Enclave researchers designed next-generation combat systems using principles that most Wastelanders had forgotten ever existed. The scientific core answered to military leadership, their work directed toward practical applications rather than pure research, every project evaluated based on its potential to advance the Enclave's strategic objectives or solve critical operational problems. The development of advanced power armor consumed vast amounts of research time and resources, each incremental improvement requiring months of testing and refinement before deployment. The X-01 series that had represented cutting-edge pre-war technology became the baseline, its design refined and improved through decades of iterative development that produced the X-02 model, serving as standard Enclave issue. These suits incorporated lessons learned from analyzing captured Brotherhood T-45 and T-51 armor, identifying weaknesses in earlier designs and addressing them through improved joint articulation, enhanced sensor packages, and more efficient power management systems that extended operational time between fusion core replacements. The armor's distinctive appearance, with its sharp angles and aggressive silhouette, projected an image of technological superiority that served psychological warfare purposes as effectively as the actual protective qualities served survival. The Hellfire armor represented the absolute pinnacle of this development lineage, a suit so advanced and resource-intensive that only a handful could be produced, reserved for the absolute elite of Enclave forces. The armor's primary innovation involved experimental thermal management systems that recycled waste heat from the fusion core and weapons fire, channeling it through specialized conduits in the armor plating to create a heat barrier that could literally vaporize incoming projectiles or burn through obstacles. This technology came at enormous cost, the suits requiring constant maintenance by specialized technicians, consuming fusion cores at rates that made extended deployments impractical, and subjecting their wearers to temperatures that would have been unbearable without the advanced cooling systems integrated into the internal bodysuit. Hellfire troopers trained to manage heat buildup during combat, learning to regulate their movements and weapons fire to avoid thermal overload, understanding that their suits gave them overwhelming advantages, but demanded attention to limitations that standard power armor users never faced. Energy weapons development proceeded along parallel tracks, researchers working to improve both the plasma and laser technologies that form the backbone of Enclave firepower. The plasma rifles issued to regular troops represented mature technology, their designs refined over decades to maximize reliability and ease of maintenance, but scientists continued pushing the boundaries of what plasma weapons could achieve. Experimental prototypes explored higher temperature plasmas, modified magnetic containment systems that could extend effective range, and rapid fire mechanisms that might allow a plasma rifle to function more like an automatic weapon than the semi-automatic weapons currently deployed. These projects consumed resources without producing immediately deployable results, but the researchers argued that breakthrough innovations required sustained investment in speculative technologies that might take years to mature into functional weapon systems. Laser weapon advancement focused on miniaturization and power efficiency, trying to pack more destructive capability into smaller packages, while reducing the strain on fusion cores and battery packs. The Gatling lasers used for vehicle and static defense applications pointed toward one direction of development: sustained fire weapons that could suppress enemy forces through sheer volume rather than individual shot lethality. Other researchers explored the opposite extreme, attempting to create laser weapons powerful enough to punch through power armor or harden defensive positions with a single sustained burst, accepting reduced ammunition capacity and increased weight in exchange for overwhelming stopping power. The practical reality of weapons development in the post-apocalyptic world meant that even the most sophisticated designs had to account for field maintenance by soldiers who might lack specialized tools or replacement parts, forcing engineers to balance performance against maintainability in ways that pre-war military contractors had rarely considered. The Duraframe eyebot program represented perhaps the most successful fusion of pre-war technology and post-war operational requirements, producing surveillance platforms that could be manufactured in relatively large numbers using salvage components while providing capabilities that human scouts could never match. The eyebot's spherical design protected delicate sensors and weapon systems, their small fusion cores providing effectively unlimited operational endurance, their ability to hover and maneuver in 3 dimensions, allowing them to access locations and vantage points impossible for ground-based forces. Enclave intelligence officers deployed these robots extensively throughout the Capital Wasteland, creating a surveillance network that fed data back to analysts at Raven Rock, who compiled detailed maps of settlements, trade routes, and the movements of potential threats like Brotherhood patrols or super mutant warbands. The most sophisticated eyebots carried not just cameras and sensors, but complete electronic warfare packages capable of intercepting radio communications, jamming enemy transmissions, and even hacking into certain pre-war computer systems that still functioned in the ruins. ED's design incorporated experimental navigation algorithms and extended-range communication systems. Its journey intended to test whether eyebots could serve as mobile relay stations, extending Enclave communications networks across continental distances. The robot's recordings of its cross-country journey provided invaluable intelligence about conditions between the east and west coasts, documenting the locations of potential threats, identifying pre-war facilities that might still contain useful technology, and mapping radiation levels and environmental hazards that might affect future Enclave operations. Intelligence and infiltration networks represented one area where the Enclave's limitations actually worked to their advantage, their small numbers and sophisticated technology allowing them to maintain covert operations that would have been impossible for larger, more conventional forces. The organization operated under multiple cover identities, using pre-war corporate structures as shells for activities that wasteland inhabitants wouldn't recognize as military operations. Poseidon Energy, the massive pre-war utility conglomerate that had operated nuclear power plants and energy distribution systems across the United States, provided particularly useful cover, its logos and branding still recognizable enough that Enclave personnel wearing maintenance uniforms bearing the company's emblem could move through certain areas without attracting immediate suspicion. The surveillance of wasteland settlements proceeded through multiple overlapping methods, combining eyebot reconnaissance with human intelligence gathered by operatives who could pass as ordinary traders or travelers. These agents moved through places like Rivet City and Megaton, listening to conversations in bars, trading for information about local politics and power structures, identifying individuals who might be recruited or exploited for Enclave purposes. The intelligence flowed back to Raven Rock through encrypted radio transmissions, burst communications that lasted only seconds, but contained compressed data about everything from settlement defenses to the personalities of local leaders, building comprehensive profiles that would guide future operations, whether those operations involved diplomacy, infiltration, or overwhelming military force. Asset recruitment focused on identifying wasteland inhabitants whose skills, knowledge, or positions made them valuable to Enclave interests, individuals who might be convinced through ideology, bribery, or coercion to serve as informants or active agents. Scientists working in independent laboratories represented particularly valuable targets, researchers who might possess pre-war technical knowledge or who had developed innovations through trial and error experimentation. The Enclave approached these individuals carefully, using intermediaries who could assess their receptiveness to recruitment before revealing the organization's true identity. Some joined willingly, seduced by promises of resources and equipment beyond anything available in the wasteland. Others required more persuasion in the form of threats against themselves or their loved ones, while a few had to be eliminated when they proved unwilling to cooperate and too knowledgeable to be allowed to remain free. Deep cover operative protocols allowed Enclave agents to maintain false identities for months or even years, living as wasteland inhabitants while secretly gathering intelligence and preparing for future operations. These operatives underwent extensive psychological conditioning to help them endure the primitive conditions of wasteland life, learning to suppress their revulsion at mutation and radiation, to eat the terrible food and drink the contaminated water without, showing distaste that might compromise their covers. They carried concealed communications equipment, allowing them to transmit intelligence at scheduled times, used dead drops to receive orders and supplies, and maintained carefully constructed backgrounds that would withstand casual investigation by suspicious wasteland inhabitants. The stress of such assignments took enormous psychological tolls, operatives returning to Raven Rock after extended deployments showing signs of trauma from prolonged exposure to the wasteland's horrors and from the moral compromises required to maintain their covers. Resource acquisition represented perhaps the Enclave's most critical ongoing challenge, the organization's technological sophistication demanding constant supplies of components, materials, and energy that couldn't be locally sourced from the immediate surroundings of their facilities. Pre-war supply cache locations had been documented in classified military databases, coordinates pointing to buried bunkers and hidden storage facilities scattered across the former United States where emergency supplies had been stockpiled against exactly the kind of catastrophe that had actually occurred. Enclave teams ventured out to recover these caches when intelligence suggested they remained intact and accessible, small squads moving quickly to excavate sites and extract supplies before Brotherhood patrols or wasteland scavengers could interfere. Many caches had been looted decades before, their contents scattered into the general wasteland economy, but enough remained sealed and undiscovered to make the effort worthwhile. Manufacturing capabilities at Raven Rock allowed the Enclave to produce certain items locally, particularly ammunition, and simple components that could be fabricated using automated systems maintained by Zax and Eden. The facility housed pre-war machine tools that could mill armor plating, stamp out weapon components, and assemble electronics from raw materials, but the range of items they could produce was limited by the availability of raw materials and the complexity of the manufacturing processes. Plasma rifle power cells could be recharged and refurbished indefinitely using specialized equipment, but eventually, even the most careful maintenance couldn't prevent components from wearing out, requiring new parts that might be impossible to manufacture without rare earth elements or specialized alloys no longer available in the post-war world. This created a constant tension between using equipment in current operations and preserving it for future needs, every expenditure of resources representing a permanent reduction in the Enclave's overall capabilities. The agricultural projects hidden within Enclave facilities represented attempts to achieve food security through hydroponic cultivation and protein synthesis, growing vegetables under artificial lighting and producing meat alternatives from algae cultures and fungal biomass. These systems produced nutritionally complete but unappetizing meals, food that sustained life without providing any of the pleasures associated with eating. Every meal, a reminder of the privations required to maintain the organization's existence. Agricultural technicians worked constantly to improve yields and expand the variety of crops that could be grown in the confined spaces available, experimenting with genetic modifications to create plants that could tolerate higher radiation levels or grow in contaminated soil, developing the capability to eventually establish surface farming operations once the wasteland's human population had been eliminated. Strategic resource hoarding focused on items that couldn't be manufactured or replaced, particularly fusion cores, advanced medical supplies, and the specialized components required for power armor and vertibird maintenance. Warehouses within Raven Rock held stockpiles of these critical materials, inventories carefully tracked and guarded by personnel who understood that losing access to these resources might mean the difference between continued operations and organizational collapse. The Enclave leadership balanced current operational needs against future requirements, sometimes choosing to limit combat deployments or postpone missions rather than expend irreplaceable resources on operations that weren't absolutely critical. This created frustration among combat personnel who wanted to engage the Brotherhood more aggressively or expand operations into new territories. But the cold mathematics of logistics allowed no other choice. Every fusion core used, every power armor component damaged beyond repair, brought the organization one step closer to the point where they could no longer field effective forces. The Enclave's story, when examined in its totality, represented a peculiar tragedy of devotion to ideals that had ceased to have meaning, a governmental structure maintaining constitutional procedures while planning genocide, military forces preserving discipline and honor while preparing to exterminate humanity in the name of its salvation. They believed themselves to be America's legitimate heirs, the last representatives of a civilization that had died in nuclear fire, never quite recognizing that their obsessive preservation of pre-war structures and their genocidal vision of restoration made them perhaps the truest expression of the forces that had caused the apocalypse in the first place. The old world had destroyed itself through nationalism, militarism, and the conviction that some lives mattered more than others, and the Enclave had learned nothing from that catastrophe except that next time they needed to be more thorough, more absolute in their application of those same lethal principles. In the end, the Enclave's elaborate governmental structures, their careful preservation of military ranks and constitutional procedures, served primarily to provide the illusion of legitimacy to an organization whose core purpose was mass murder on a scale that would have made the Great War seem merciful by comparison. They maintained the forms of civilization while planning its final destruction, speaking of restoration, while developing weapons to ensure that only their narrow definition of humanity would survive to inherit whatever world remained after they finished poisoning the wells and burning away everyone who didn't meet their genetic standards. The oil rig's destruction scattered them. Raven Rock's eventual fall would scatter them further, but the ideology survived in the minds of true believers who would carry the Enclave's vision forward even as its material power crumbled into memory, a ghost haunting the wasteland's future as surely as the pre-war world haunted its present.